but I've never seen a more delusional sense of the distribution of power in the world, Pascal. And that's usually conducive to armed conflict because we think we're stronger than we are. And then when we realize that we're not, how do we react to that? Do we sort of recalibrate or do we lash out? And to some degree, what I'm saying to you is Donald Trump is applying cowboy diplomacy because he thinks the United States remains the arbiter of world affairs. He thinks that our markets are indispensable to the global economy. Unfortunately, they're not. And so I don't think those tactics are going to work.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Cameron Macgregor, an entrepreneur who founded a free speech platform, a fellow YouTuber with a channel on finance and geopolitics, and a Substack writer. His home country, the United States, and the state of its politics is what we want to discuss today. So, Cameron, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the chat.
Well, thanks for coming online. The two of us, we met about 3 weeks ago in Canada, and we had a chance to exchange a bit on the sidelines of an event. And I really wanted to have you on the channel to get your insights about what's happening with the US, because you're coming from I would say, from an analyst's perspective and from correct me if I'm wrong, from a conservative point of view of what the United States is doing and where it should be going. And you founded this free speech platform that I found fascinating. Could you tell us about it and why you think free speech might still be in a problematic place, even in this new Trump administration that just said so clearly free speech is back?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about free speech in the United States. In fact, there has been for almost a decade now, and I would say it really kicked off when Donald Trump ran for president, starting in 2015. He was elected, as we know at this stage, much to the chagrin of the Washingtonian, New York, LA elite. But it was also a shock. It was quite a shock because Donald Trump got overwhelmingly negative marks from the mainstream press, what a lot of people refer to as the legacy media, right? I think there was actually a study put out by Harvard that said that over 90% of all comments that came from major news outlets like CNN, CBS, you probably remember this, were negative, and yet he won anyway. So this was quite a puzzle that set a lot of research in motion to exactly uncover what had happened. And I think the best account of it came from a nonprofit called Data and Society in a study called the Alternative Influence Network. And basically, what they discovered was that there was a whole cottage industry of dissident thinking, of content creation on YouTube and other platforms that was sort of circumnavigating the legacy platform. Now, I say all of that because free speech in the United States, and I think in the Western world right now, is definitely under siege. It has been for some time, not necessarily from a legal standpoint. That's part of it. But ultimately, if you want free speech, Pascal, you need what Oliver Wendell Holmes called a marketplace of ideas. In this sense, the marketplace is as important as the ideas. What is the marketplace? It's basically the platforms. It is the structure of the information networks themselves. And the reason why Trump was elected, what carried his message to market, were all of these alternative platforms that emerged. Unfortunately, the reaction to that was then a massive campaign of censorship to either wipe out channels that were promoting a pro-Trump agenda by deplatforming, demonetizing them, or what have you, or by closing down their bank accounts. So effectively, what you had was censorship via the financial system and this sort of structure of information, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or what have you, who were responding to pressure groups that wanted Trump's message shut down. Now, your question is, has that meaningfully changed? It has to some degree because of folks like Elon Musk that have purchased Twitter outright and tried to corner that marketplace of ideas such that it's more conducive to open and free-flowing debate. That really is the battle that we're facing. Ad Actum, which is the free speech platform I set up, was really designed to be a financial organization that would get equity in the marketplace of ideas, in platforms, so that people could get their content to market without being disrupted. That battle is still being waged as we speak. Trump's victory, I think, to some degree has loosened up some of the censorship. You recently probably heard that Mark Zuckerberg was decrying some of the censorship that he authorized on his own platform. That is a reflection of a shift in the power structure. But ultimately, who controls the marketplace, who controls these platforms, both in the financial system and in the media, that's who controls free speech. And that is very much still a battle.
There is this huge push that we have seen at least since COVID to to argue that there is a right for free speech, but there's not a right to be heard. At least in the European context, that was uttered quite a few times, right? You
Yes.
have a right to say whatever you want, but there's no right to be broadcasted. So the
Yes.
state has a right to crack down on platforms when when the state decides that there is information or that there's misinformation that it doesn't want to spread. Now, again, this then of course implies that there's an arbiter of truth. And the US Constitution was explicitly formulated. I mean, the First Amendment was explicitly formulated under the idea that there should not be a central arbiter of truth. I do perceive the United States as one of the Western countries with the strongest of all safeguards for this idea that there's no arbiter of truth and that anything goes except for immediate calls to violence, which the only thing that in the United States you're not allowed to say is go kill this man. But even things like we should kill the President of the United States is protected by the US Constitution as free speech act, just not like pointing in front of a mob to somebody and saying, let's kill that one. That's the only one that I think your Supreme Court judged is not protected because it immediately puts people at risk. Where do you think this principle of the U.S. Constitution of the amendment is standing today, and who's supporting it and who's working against it in the political
Yeah.
process? Like which forces?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate to be sure. There's something in the United States called Section 230. And Section 230 basically allows platforms to host whatever content they want and be absolved from the consequences of what content creators on that platform say. So there is very definitely a battle going on to try and overturn that and make the host of a platform responsible for the content that's put forth on it. That's very tricky to be sure. I think protecting Section 230 is vital because we want to make sure, to your point, that folks are not just speaking into a vacuum, that they are in fact heard. Now, I don't think that we need any revolutionary laws to deal with this. What we really need is political pushback to hold legacy institutions, both in the financial system and I would say in the halls of power, accountable by political opposition. Ultimately, this is what Donald Trump represents, or at least in theory, what he has done is he's tried to push back against these narratives that have become unchallengeable. The only way to do that, Pascal, is in the political process itself. And I do think that's happening. I think it's happening not just because Elon Musk bought Twitter. I also think it's happening, believe it or not, in the Bitcoin space because there's a very real awareness of financial censorship. And as I said, the legal component here is really not the big enchilada. It's ultimately leveraging the banking system to demonetize, deplatform, shut down your ability to be heard because you can't monetize it. That's the key. And I do think censorship resistance through Bitcoin, through cryptocurrency, as well as political opposition in the form of Donald Trump, that's the key piece to that. But to the overarching point here, I would say, is this battle's not over yet. It really is not. It's ongoing, and we have to sustain the momentum, I think, that Donald Trump set in motion some 8 years ago.
I find this super interesting because I think if I understand it correctly, you belong to the people who argue for the power or the ability of Bitcoin and these cryptocurrencies that are not centrally controlled by the banking system to actually help societies to free themselves. I had somebody on this channel, the a professor on modern monetary theory, who I think you would quite a bit disagree with. But what is how do you view the monetary system and how these new assets, I would not classify them as necessarily as money, but as assets, how they impact the free speech debate and society in general?
Yeah, there's something I've referred to it as the leftist corporate state. So when you think of political opposition, for example, to make America great again, or the right wing in the United States, or even free speech, it's not exclusively coming from the government. It's not exclusively coming from the media or the banking system. It's all of these things connected together. And if you pay keen attention, you'll see that diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental, social governance, all of these ideas, climate change, for example, they become almost institutionalized in these centers of power. So the only way to provide a counterbalancing force or a counter narrative is to have technologies like Bitcoin, platforms like Twitter, and political opposition to them. Otherwise, there's a total monopoly because of the power of these centralized institutions to control the truth, to be that arbiter of truth, whether that what they're saying is true or not. That's really the delicate balance that we weave. And I would simply say that the legacy institutions in the Western world, and I know we're going to build on this theme in this interview, they're corrupted, and they're largely corrupted by a Western elite that is corrupted, that is sort of in decline. And so they perceive anything that threatens their power as hostile, subversive, or untrue. And they're leveraging these institutions to shut down debate. These new technologies, I think Bitcoin's one of them, and building alternative media are crucial to fighting back.
the 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 media or the alternative media on which discussions like this or also this like a lot of the media coverage of Mr. Trump that you mentioned earlier took place is actually also still controlled in a very traditional way. You know, the pyramid, the top down, where one person or a couple of people a board take decisions, policy decisions that are then pushed down. And I think Twitter is also a good example of that. I mean, Twitter changed, even became X, and it became more open once Elon Musk took it over, right? It's still this kind of the central control of a small group of people is still pivotal in those platforms. Are you seeing that changing anytime soon?
Well, what's interesting about it is so there's been a lot of studies on millennials and Gen Z. So that's basically people that are about 40 years of age and younger. And what we've learned about their habits, particularly in terms of consuming news, is that they don't watch the legacy media at all. Not at all. They consume virtually entirely what comes from Instagram or Twitter, these kinds of outlets. Now, you're quite right that potentially they could be vulnerable too, based on who acquires them. I think that that's right. And that brings us to the fundamental quandary here. This is a human problem. No technology is a panacea. We have effectively need pushback from human beings in political movements, in technology movements that are going to be the guardians of free speech. If we don't have them, we could definitely lose it, right? So that's ultimately what it comes down to. That being said, awareness of the corruption of the legacy press, maybe some holes in some of these legacy arguments are at peak. And that's represented in what you see from millennials and Gen Z, who are not simply tuning out legacy press, but they don't believe it either, right? Confidence or trust in what the mainstream press is telling you has collapsed. So I think that's a very good thing because it speaks to skepticism and an open mindedness regarding the information that you're being fed. As long as that skepticism is there and stays strong, I think that the future for free speech in the United States will be strong as well.
The interesting thing, just as a piece of information for you, is that the majority of viewers of this channel are 50 and above, and especially 65 and above. So definitely collapse the trust among the other generations is also collapsing. And funnily enough, it seems at least here for these kinds of conversations, the older the population, the more distrust grows again, and the seeking out of alternative voices. Now, currently, do you think that in the United States, this is going to be better under the current administration, or that are we experiencing just a break in the censorship push, which I do think we've experienced, especially under Mr. Biden, and especially coming out of COVID. COVID was very harmful to the free speech movement because of a larger societal agreement that certain information or certain voices must not circulate, otherwise people will die. And that idea really hurt quite a bit. How do you see this happening now, and then also like looking 4 years into the future? Do you think that other forces will try to restrict the space of the sayable again?
It's very interesting because if you go back to COVID, COVID was very definitely a watershed moment because it unveiled to some degree the extent to which there was censorship. I think there were a lot of people, particularly in the Western world, who had never experienced anything like that before. And I think a lot of people sort of went into the COVID experience trusting the government, just sort of blindly having faith in what the legacy institutions were telling them. And come to find out that COVID certainly was not what it was presented to be. And there were all kinds of holes in vaccines and other components to that narrative that I think has only strengthened the free speech movement and only raised skepticism of what the legacy institutions and governments, not just in the US, but I think across the Western world, because certainly people that are not terribly political who were directly affected by that started to say, well, if I'm being fed misinformation on this issue, which is very important and existential, what else am I being lied to about? So I think it actually opened the door. As far as Trump is concerned, it is to some degree a conundrum. I do think that Donald Trump's legacy to some degree is that he has ventured into taboo topics and mainstreamed a lot of conversations that previously people would simply not discuss. Immigration certainly being a leading candidate among them as perhaps the most taboo topic. That being said, at the same time, it does seem as though the forces around Trump, some of which we'll elaborate on in just a moment, are certainly trying to close down discussion of our relationship with Israel, for example, and our unilateral support for potentially what's going to be a Middle Eastern war. So it is a mixed bag. On the whole, however, I think doors have been opened to some taboo topics that cannot be closed at this stage.
Then let's go there. Let's discuss a little bit your new president. On the one hand, he is saying time and again that he wants to end the war in Ukraine, and it seems that he's working on that. On the other hand, he just recently came out with this bombshell announcement that he wants the United States to own Gaza. And what do you make out of his policies? How, after a month, how do you assess where he is with his promises?
You know, uh, when thinking about Donald Trump in the United States, people tend to think in sort of phase one and phase two, or Trump 1.0 versus Trump 2.0. Trump 1.0 being a man that was not political for most of his life, sort of entering into a world he didn't terribly understand and making certain mistakes that undermined his administration, undermined his own agenda. For example, bringing in people and making them Secretary of State or National Security Advisor that were decidedly against his America First agenda. The theory, or I suppose the case for Donald Trump 2.0 was that this time he would do things correctly. This time he would be distinct. He understood the problem. He understood he needed to bring his own team in, so forth and so on. I have very serious reasons to doubt that that is the case, and I'll explain why. If you go back to August, I'm sorry, I guess it was July, midsummer of last year, the Democratic Party basically fell apart when Joe Biden had a disastrous presidential debate. You probably recall that he was noticeably aged and senile. And at that point, it just became impossible to support him. And a lot of donors pulled their money. And that's when the DNC basically said, look, we got to move on from him. Then came Kamala Harris, who was not really elected in any meaningful sense. She was just sort of a substitute that was put forward. But there was a lot of effort in the mainstream press, maybe the legacy institutions, if you want to use that term, to push her. And then it became clear that she just wasn't qualified to be president either. She had some disastrous interviews. At that point, something very interesting happened. All of a sudden, the press sort of changed its tune on Donald Trump. All of a sudden, Donald Trump became far from a deplorable candidate. He became presidential. And some very destructive forces, you might say, the donor class, seemed to switch sides. This is the genesis of people like Miriam Adelson, the widow of the billionaire that backed Trump, in 2016. But she all of a sudden became very prominent, and others like her seemed to subvert his agenda, in particular on the question of Israel. Now, that brings us to the present day. Donald Trump rode a wave of hopium that he would very quickly, by his own words, sort of bring peace to the Middle East, end the conflict with Ukraine. And it seems as though that's hit a wall very, very quickly. Why is that? Well, it seems to me because a lot of the people around Donald Trump agree with the Biden administration's foreign policy, that there is a kind of continuity of government that may have been part of a deal that he brokered to guarantee that he would win in 2024. Now, I know that sounds a bit conspiratorial, but if you look at some of the people like Howard Lutnick, for example, that are in his administration, it raises a lot of serious questions. And then, of course, you get to the Netanyahu conference, if you will, or visit, in which Donald Trump seems to spring this plan out of nowhere, wherein the United States would not only intervene on behalf of Israel, which it has been doing historically and more intensely with time, but now that we would wholesale, arbitrarily seize, which I think is basically encroaching on international law, territory of a third party, of a people, in this case, the Palestinians, on behalf of a foreign power. And if you go back and you look at Netanyahu, he seemed gleeful to learn that news. And now we find out that armaments to Israel, not only have they continued, but we're giving them even more lethal equipment. And it looks like Donald Trump is threatening Hamas that if they don't deliver these prisoners, that there's going to be a resumption of hostility. That tells me that Donald Trump 2.0 was never what people thought he was. And that's why everything is sort of stalled.
The whole question of like who else this apart from Trump is going to run his administration. I mean, his appointees and his political allies, and of course, then the people that gave money to him and are probably important for him personally. That's something that has been talked about for a long time. Um, where do you think that his information is coming from? There has been also a lot of talk about him appointing Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national security, national director of
Intelligence.
intelligence,
Yes.
national intelligence agencies. Because the hope was that through a better structure there, he would have access to proper intelligence of what's happening. Because one of the things that has been so infuriating to us is that, especially about the narrative about Russia and Ukraine, we've learned that mainstream media has been constantly feeding the general public an image of Russia or an image and an analysis of the war and of the conflict that just doesn't correspond with facts on the ground. It just doesn't.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and we know that Donald Trump also gets a lot of information from the media, from social media and mainstream. Do you think that his information bubble has improved compared to the first administration, or has it just shifted?
It seems that it's shifted. And your question is an apt one because I think in answering that question, you have to understand the nature of Washington, D.C. If you go back to the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was elected president, he brought in a new team of people to sort of reshape American foreign policy. But what he didn't have to do was completely uproot a legacy structure. In other words, there was still a kind of viable governance in place that he could marry his new team to and the legacy institutions. What Donald Trump is facing is multi generations of people that are hostile to Russia, that see the world in very binary terms. We are either in the neoliberal paradigm or we're in an authoritarian umbrella. China, North Korea, Russia, these are all countries that are very different and distinct, But according to the neoliberal view, they're all one thing. They're all authoritarian. They're all bad. They're the axis of evil, as George W. Bush alluded to it. The people that think that way, that come out of Georgetown University, that come out of the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins, that populate the mainstream press, that occupy the offices of the State Department, that support people like Marco Rubio, who's the new Secretary of State, they're still there. And that is the product of the machine that is Washington, D.C. These are, again, the legacy institutions, as I call them. The only way to uproot that is fundamental reorganization of the government and replacing it with a new kind of team that is of a new and different party. I don't see evidence that Donald Trump has done that. It strikes me that he's still reliant upon the same feeder systems, the same kind of experts to staff his administration and give him the information that he wants. Now, some hold out hope that Tulsi Gabbard, as an example, maybe RFK Jr., as another example, could get in and sort of shake up the administration. We'll have to see. It's early yet. But even if Tulsi gets in there, she's still dealing with a legacy of people who've been there for decades that believe that Russia equals the Soviet Union and that Putin is no different than Stalin. This is what these people think. There's only one way to deal with that, and that is, again, a wholesale reorganization of the government. And thus far, I have not seen that.
Um, Wholesale reorganization or these tabula rasa moments are really difficult to organize because
Yes,
the structure depends upon who else has been in there, right? It's really,
yes,
really hard to do. It's even hard to do if you win a war against an enemy. I mean, it was hard for the US to pull this off in Japan and also in Germany. You need to rely
yes,
upon the structures that are there already. But we
yes.
do see that this is something that he's trying to do. And here I have this question about Donald Trump's approach or how you interpret it. Because on the one hand, he is now bringing back these very old notions of great powers just going in and taking plots of land, right? When it comes to Gaza, we go in, we use the military, we take this land, we can take it, we have the right to do it. On the other hand, he undermines or he explicitly um, tries to dismantle modern institutions of what lefties like me have been calling institutions of American imperialism, which is the this neocon approach, the sneaky approach through US AID and through the National Endowment for Democracy, to achieve to influence foreign countries and sometimes even overthrow them, or instigate color revolutions, which is a modern form of a powerful nation state to control the client states, right, through subtle mechanisms. So he's dismantling this arm, or it seems so, while he's building up the other, the let's just use military might, or let's use the threat of military might to get what we want. How do you make sense of these parallel developments?
Yeah, it's interesting because part of the problem for Donald Trump, and you see this manifest in his dialogue on trade. So I think the president feels very comfortable talking about economic issues, perhaps more so than he does geopolitical issues, a lot of which I don't think he really understands. Okay. And he doesn't necessarily need to have a sophisticated worldview insofar as he understands first, do no harm.
Mm,
First, don't make the situation worse. The issue is, if you look at his comments on trade, he externalizes a lot of problems in the United States. For example, he set up something called the External Revenue Service. And the messaging behind that, Pascal, has been we're going to make the Chinese, the Canadians, the Mexicans, et cetera, pay revenue to us for their crimes against us. I'm being slightly hyperbolic, but more or less, that's his view. Now, the Chinese didn't deindustrialize the United States. The Chinese didn't make bad deals. Okay. Our leadership did. Our own government was negligent on the Mexican border. I'm not saying that Mexico and China and so forth didn't necessarily exploit that situation to their own ends. Of course, most nations do that. But the framework of externalizing the problem, which is what Donald Trump is doing in terms of trade, mirrors exactly what the neocons do regarding foreign policy in general. Again, it's Iran who's evil. It's Russia who's evil. It's Russia who caused this war, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, Trump doesn't break free from that delusional paradigm. And that's instructive to understand because it explains why there's still continuity. And even the procedure by which he's engaging countries in the Middle East, or by talking to the Russians, maybe not talking to them, a very sort of confused state of affairs, demonstrates that he still doesn't really understand, Pascal, what you and I know intuitively, namely that the world has changed and that to the extent the United States has declined, it's our own fault. It's because of corrupt governance. It's because of a kind of decline of elites who didn't really understand the world that they were in. It's because the CIA, in conjunction with U.S. military power, launched 80 to 100 regime changes since 1945. That's our fault, and we have to deal with that. Donald Trump is not doing so. He is externalizing the problem in a different way, to be sure, but I fail to see how that is really getting us back to the kind of foreign policy that we had before World War II, which, as you know, was focused on neutrality and building good relations with the rest of the world, which I think to some degree Trump appealed to, but it just doesn't match his policy making. That's sort of the issue that we face.
This is very interesting, and the United States has played an outsized role, especially in its own hemisphere, in the Americas, for forever. One of the one of the big complaints that all my South American or friends have, Central American and South American friends, is that the term American is used by US citizens to refer to themselves exclusively, not to
Yes,
everybody else. They say like, we are
yes.
American too. I mean, they're just one out of many of us, right? Um, do you, how do you see this developing? Because if one thing that Donald Trump very clearly says is that he wants to stop the decline of the United States, right, and make America great
Yes.
again, and establishing it as one of the great powers. Now, his pick for his foreign secretary, Marco Rubio, recently said, "We are living in a new world. We have now China and Russia as power centers too. These are great powers. This is the normal structure," and he wants to
Yes.
establish the U.S. as one of those. But that clearly, to me, also his rhetoric toward Panama and toward Greenland indicates that, being the first among equals in the Americas is a given. That's something that
Yes.
everybody else naturally has to accept. How is
Yes.
that going down? You just spent some a good time in South America. How's that going down in the rest of the Americas?
It's very interesting because I was in Colombia, Mexico, which are really at the heart of Latin America, Mexico in particular, as you know, which is Mesoamerica basically. And then I was in Argentina. And it was very different to see how Argentinos reacted to me and to the United States, at least as an idea or as a relationship, versus Colombia and Mexico. In Mexico and Colombia, especially among the educated elites, there's very definitely a hostility towards the United States. And a lot of this is a legacy of the Cold War. It's a legacy of the interventionism that we've engaged upon. I tend to sit more right than left, as I think you're aware, but Noam Chomsky has written a series of books on America's misbegotten adventures into Latin America for a long time. People in that part of the world remember these things. They understand them and they know sort of who's behind the scenes operating the machinery. And unfortunately, it's been the CIA, as I said earlier, or it's been other forces in the United States. As a result of that, I think that Colombia, Mexico, maybe Latin America in general, certainly Brazil, what are they doing? They're looking more east. They're looking towards the BRICS. They're looking towards China. That shift was very palpable as far as I'm concerned. Argentina, although, was a bit different. In Argentina, as you probably know, Milei is trying to revitalize the economy. He's trying to get inflation under control. And what is he doing? He's trying to peg towards the dollar. And he's sort of made some very controversial statements, very negative comments, I would say, about the East. In fact, he was interviewed when I was down there about the East versus the West. And he basically said Argentina should partner with the civilized side of life. And he said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And his answer was the West. Now, far be it from me to say Milei is wrong, But in this case, I think he is. I think he's categorically wrong. I think it's very clear that one of the major themes we're living under, you specifically, Pascal, being in Japan, is that the East has changed. It has reorganized. It has a new sense of self-confidence, particularly the Chinese. And I think the East is rising, whereas the West is sort of in decline, certainly on a relative basis. Guess who doesn't understand that? Donald Trump. Donald Trump, and I think a lot of his supporters too, a lot of America First folks, their view on the United States is we've had a bad run. We've had some misbegotten ventures. We've had some poor policies. All we need to do is tweak things on the edge, and we'll get right back to where we were in 1990 to the unipolar moment. I think it goes without saying that that world is over. We are in a new multipolar world, one in which the United States is one of the great powers, but that is not the perception necessarily of the DC elite. And by the way, I'm not sure that is understood in Europe either by the Euro elites who are still looking at the United States as the unipower in the world.
Yeah, I share that assessment, and especially about the Europeans. The one thing that I find funny from coming from Americans, and I mean North and South, is this still this European framing of how the world works. Because funnily enough, if you're sitting in any one of the Americas and you want to go to the East, you would naturally in an airplane travel west, right?
Right,
They're to the
right,
west of you. To the east
right,
is actually the Europeans, right? And
right.
the history of especially of the United States, of the way its colonization and then development worked, was east to west, right? So
Yes.
including the last state to be added, which is far in the west, is Hawaii, right? Um,
No, it's a good point. Just a moment on geography, because Europeans, as you know, tend to be much better at geography than Americans, and that's something people sort of chide Americans with. But there's a lot of depth to that comment, and here's why. When you think of the United States, you have to remember how geographically remote it really is, right? We have two oceans on either side, and what that means is that a lot of Americans do not travel. Logistically, economically, it's just not that easy to get to Europe, to get to Asia. Now, fortunately for me, what has shaped a lot of my worldview, probably like yourself, is I've been to over 30 countries. I have lived in Hong Kong. I've been to Bangkok, Thailand. I've been to Japan. I've been all over South America. I've been to Latin America. I've been all over Europe. And when you go to these places, you realize that, this planet America, as we see it, and we see everything really through the lens of the Second War as sort of this framework that puts us as the sun in the solar system. That world really never existed. We think it did, but it never really did. And it's not so much because we are delusional as much as it is the world is a very big and complicated place. And what fundamentally drives things is what's happening locally, not what's happening in the United States. It's very difficult for Americans to grasp that by virtue of geography. It's not ignorance as much as it is we're just remote. The joke that I think throws this into sharp relief, I was down in Argentina and I was on a date with a gal who was a porteña. So they're the girls that are from Buenos Aires, which is where Milei's from. And she said, "Oh, you Americans, you live in your own world." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You're the only country in the world to have a championship of sports teams only from your country, and you call them world champions." I think that summarizes it pretty well.
I mean, this is also like this is also one source of power, isn't it? Of the people of the I don't like to use the word elites, but the ones who then have an outsized impact on the political system, like we, especially the millionaires, like the donor class, right? People who have a lot of capital in order to invest into political campaigns. If a big part of the population, who you of course still need, is actually kept ignorant in the way that they are just not able to travel that much, right? Because it costs money. And the United States, despite being the richest country on earth, well, sorry, that's not true. I mean, depending on how you measure it, but the
Yes.
largest economy, at least one of the largest economy that still has a very significant part of the population that is poor in one or the other sense. A large percentage of people who lives paycheck to paycheck and therefore cannot go out and travel, cannot see these other places, and therefore relies upon what is being said about them. Now,
Yes.
one thing that is changing, that is social media, and we are seeing also how the elites are getting very jumpy about suddenly people being able to converse with Chinese
Yes.
or with Russians, and how this flow of information is being interrupted artificially.
Yes.
Um, where do you see that going?
Getting back just for a moment, geography is just so crucial, right? It really is. It drives so much. Americans, by default, actually have a very robust worldview, despite the lack of access to places around the world. They sort of prioritize what happens locally. They think first about their own economy. They think first about what we confront here in the United States, as well they should. And they're disinclined to go abroad and lecture, intervene militarily, economically, or otherwise to get bogged down in the affairs of other states. They really don't support that. And if you look at polling data in the United States going back to the 80s, consistently for decades, Americans have said, look, we don't want war. We don't want to be involved in these countries around the world. However, guess who does? Unfortunately, it's the elites. To be clear, when I say elite, what do I mean? I don't necessarily mean people that are billionaires that are operating at a very high level and have limitless resources. No, what I mean are people that are going to Ivy League schools, people that are going to the Ford Service School at Georgetown. They're indoctrinated in this perception of the world that holds the United States at the center, and everything else sort of orbits around it. And a lot of those folks, in order to get ahead in the government, Pascal, they don't travel. They stay in Washington, D.C., and they sort of play in the palace intrigue in order to advance up the corporate ladder. You don't get ahead in the State Department by having a solid expertise and understanding of Mandarin as much as you do spending time in DC and climbing that political ladder. That has undermined our ability to understand the rest of the world in ways that I think are incalculable. And it's an important point because I do think that differentiates us to some degree from the British Empire, in which you had people that I think were far better educated, that were experts in their arena. We don't have that as much in the United States. I mean, our numbers of Russian speakers, Chinese speakers that are in the State Department, in intelligence agencies, it's a very low number. It's dangerously low. And that also adds to this institutional brain drain. As to your question about connectivity, it's hard to say because social media is very viral and algorithmically it can be very unstable. So, in other words, you can get these meta narratives, like, for example, the Chinese are communists, and that can go viral on certain social media platforms and actually make the cognitive dissonance that much greater. That being said, what I see as a coherent theme across the world is that people increasingly outside of these governments don't buy the narrative that the Chinese are the enemies or the Russians are the enemies or what have you. In other words, there's no real appetite for war, for kinetic conflict. That's what I see wherever I travel. Virtually nobody wants it. That being said, I equally detect in among the BRICS, for example, when I've been to Asia, I see this in public statements from the foreign minister of India, for example, is that these countries are simply not going to tolerate American interventionism anymore, nor are they going to tolerate this sort of condescending rhetoric that comes out of the West, that we've got everything right and they have everything wrong. Whether it's human rights, it's economic development, it's pollution, there's a very real resistance that's building to that sort of America knows best complex.
I find this one most striking at the moment because it's the BRICS and the this emancipation of a large part of the world, saying that we now want to be done not just with colonialism but neo-colonialism too, and this interference in our affairs, and we want to chart out a third force. Not necessarily, we don't want to side with any enemies. We're not siding with anyone. We're just siding with ourselves. That's where a lot of my studies and also this channel is coming from. Is like we just do our own thing, and that then creates a more, not just a multipolar world, not just US, China, and Russia. It also creates Malaysia and India and Indonesia. It creates
Yes.
Ghana and South Africa, of course. It
Yes.
creates Brazil as not playing on the same field when it comes to military or to the economy or to infrastructure building, but it creates a more diverse international environment that then links up with each other, right? Um, how do you see that now influencing the American psyche that on the one hand seems to still be longing to go back to a unipolar world and having problems with the tripolar idea, right? But it's actually even more than that. It's multinodal, as Chas Freeman keeps saying.
Yes, I think Chaz Freeman is a brilliant man, and he's got it right. The only addendum I would add to his perception or his model, if you will, and I made a video on my channel that actually did pretty well addressing this subject. It was all about China, really, but it was a pushback on what's been called the Washington Consensus. So, for those of you who do not know, the Washington Consensus is basically privatize, liberalize, and globalize. Now, this comes from I believe a British economist named John Williamson in the late 80s who came up with this sort of buzzword. But that's what drives the IMF. That's what drives the World Bank. That's the way a lot of the elites in the Eurozone think, is that this is sort of the model towards modernization, or rather, this is the pathway to ascending economically, politically, et cetera, et cetera. What we've observed from China in particular, but the East in general, to your point, whether you're talking about Southeast Asia, countries like India or Indonesia, maybe even the Emirates in the Middle East, countries like Iran, Russia, for example, is that these countries are growing economically, that they're actually getting stronger militarily. Some of them are becoming great powers in ways that we did not predict before, because we assumed that there was only one way to do things. There was only one formula that you had to follow to grow your wealth. China is, I think, the greatest example that rejects this paradigm. So if you read a document that was called Made in China 2025, which was written about 10 years ago, the Chinese basically did an analysis of the United States and our pathway to modernization. And their answer was, well, it wasn't the Washington Consensus. It wasn't liberalize, privatize, and globalize. It was industrial technology and manufacturing. That's what we want to replicate. And guess what? They have. And now China, I think, is actually a greater economic power than the United States. Now, as to your question, how is this affecting the psyche of Americans? America, and perhaps most countries are this way, but America in particular is inside out, not outside in. So what drives us is what happens here first, what happens out there last, to be sure. Remember, James Carville, who was a political advisor for Bill Clinton, once said, "It's the economy, stupid." What Americans are thinking about today is their standard of living is falling. The job market is poor. Prices are rising. Corruption in the political system is acute. The border is collapsing. The sort of greatness that we once had simply is not there. That's what they're trying to wrap their heads around. Now, what the elites are feeding them, and what even Donald Trump is feeding them to some degree, is that, again, this is externalized. This is because of bad trade deals that we've done with the evil Chinese, or this is because of the rise of Russia, or what have you. Of course, that's not really the case. And I don't think that most Americans buy into that. That being said, I do think that this event in Ukraine has been quite shocking to the DC elite. And here's why. If you go back to 2000, if you go back to 2022, the reflexive response to Russia's invasion, number one, was total shock. Nobody in DC thought that the Russians would do it. And the reason was we felt, well, they're afraid of the sanctions. So then they invade. Then we slap them with sanctions, and the expectation was, well, they'll turn against Putin and the economy will collapse. This was widely believed in Washington, D.C., okay, almost as an article of faith. Okay, so then that doesn't happen. Then the sentiment was, well, the whole world will align with us to isolate the Russians because they're the bad guys. Then the Indians the Chinese and practically others, even some inside the Eurozone, said, hold on a second, what's really going on here? We don't agree with ostracizing Russia for all kinds of reasons. That came as a big shock to the DC elite, both in terms of a measure of our external influence and power, but also because the Russians, it seemed, internally were much stronger, not just militarily, but economically than we expected. Because again, we live in this neoliberal world where either you're a part of the Western modern world or you're an authoritarian, backward, inefficient, degraded country. And that completely burst that bubble. That has had a big impact on the psyche of the DC elites, to be sure.
Okay, so it is the, for lack of a better word, but the seeping in of reality. Because you can pretend that Russia, you can say, like Mr. McCain did forever, that Russia is just a gas station masquerading as a country, right? That's a very it's a lovely little slur in order to deride a potential a geopolitical rival, but it's not actually reality, right? So, and this conflict, then, do you think it is a sobering moment overall for especially for these for the group of people that has this outsized influence in terms of wealth and power in Washington, to say like, oh, maybe we believed too much of our own propaganda?
Yes, I do. And look, I think the specter of doubt is rising. I think questions are beginning to be asked or posed about the building blocks of our power. Just speaking in terms of industry, I started my career, Pascal, you may not know this, in the Navy. And the U.S. Navy, the U.S. military in general, carries a great halo effect. As I'm sure you know, it is widely believed, especially in the United States, and I think to some degree, although to a lesser extent in the rest of the world, that the United States has the greatest military in the world, and it's completely unchallengeable. Well, in the 1980s, we had a 600 ship Navy. That 600 ship Navy has basically shrunk down to about 200 ships, most of which are decades old, in very poor shape, in need of repair and maintenance. And guess what? We don't have the industrial capacity to replace them. There was a report put out by the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, that basically concluded that the Chinese have more shipbuilding capacity in one of their shipyards than we have at all of ours combined. Now, added to that, you have the fiscal problems. Added to that, you have, I would say, the deplorable state of recruitment for the U.S. military in the United States. In other words, nobody really wants to join the military, and the quality of people that we have in the service has declined as well for all kinds of reasons that we can go into another time. Either way, these cracks in the edifice of our sort of dominance, our hegemony in the world, they're beginning to spread. And I do think there is an awareness of that. However, as I said, I don't think Donald Trump fully understands this. His sense is these are marginal problems, not structural problems that we can fix sort of with the stroke of an executive order. He's about to discover that that's not the case. And just one thing to add on this regarding trade, I saw a statistic, I want to say a few months ago, regarding Chinese trade. The Chinese, number one, their manufacturing capacity is not only greater than the United States today, it's bigger than the United States or Western Europe combined. Combined. So that's one just monumental statistic. In addition to that, the Chinese are now trading more with Southeast Asian countries than they are with the United States. So, what does that tell you about the relative appreciation of economic power in the world? That hasn't registered with Donald Trump yet. I don't think it's registered with Americans in general yet. That's the next sort of red pill moment, if you will, that's coming, is that the military dominance we think we have, it's not there. The economic dominance that we thought we had, it's not really there either. This is coming, and it's coming fast.
You mean the moment the United States has to discover that it will put the most draconian of sanctions on its adversaries and third parties, and the third parties will be saying like, I mean, yeah, you're a nice market, but you're not the only game in town. I mean, okay, then
Exactly.
we don't trade with you. Fine. You
Exactly.
mean that one?
It's very interesting because you mentioned Chaz Freeman earlier. He wrote a very good piece. I think you asked him about it on your show, actually, which was about diplomacy. And there were two things about that piece that I thought stood out. One is he used this term empathy. He said you have to be empathetic, which does not mean sympathetic, right? It doesn't mean I feel bad necessarily, which a lot of Westerners they'll use that term. I sympathize as if the global South is incapable of doing anything, right? There's this sort of condescension involved in that. No, it's empathy. Empathy means that you understand not just their point of view, but the distribution of power in the world. This is the most dangerous time I think I've seen. I'm 40 years old. I'm not very old, to be sure, but I've never seen a more delusional sense of the distribution of power in the world, Pascal. And that's usually conducive to armed conflict because we think we're stronger than we are. And then when we realize that we're not, how do we react to that? Do we sort of recalibrate or do we lash out? And to some degree, what I'm saying to you is Donald Trump is applying cowboy diplomacy because he thinks the United States remains the arbiter of world affairs. He thinks that our markets are indispensable to the global economy. Unfortunately, they're not. And so I don't think those tactics are going to work.
I agree. I mean, the some aspects of them will impact, especially the immediate neighbors. So Canada and Mexico are probably now struggling heavily in how to navigate this new administration. But we are nearing the 1 hour mark, so I do have to wrap this up. Cameron, people who want to read or watch more from you, where should they go?
Yes, follow me on YouTube. It's at neo dash masculinity, or follow me on Substack. I have a Substack that's called Men and the City. And essentially, the macro thesis, if you will, that underpins everything that I write about is sort of the rise of what I call Masco nationalism, or the reset of politics in the Western world that's beginning with young men. And this is manifest all over Europe in the rise of new parties, and is certainly what's fueling the Make America Great Again movement in the United States. So follow me on Substack at Men in the City, and then follow me on YouTube at Neo Masculinity.
Where should young women go who find the analysis correct? Everybody.
It is welcome to all, but certainly the specter of this movement that I see that I think is going to reorganize and transform the West to make it more congruent, I think, with reality. That is happening in the minds of young men. Women, I think, will come along for the ride, but at the moment, it's certainly the genesis of it, I think, is in young men.
At some point, we're going to organize a discussion with a feminist friend of mine from Sweden. I
Sure,
think that will be an interesting one.
sure.
But I would like to thank you for your insight, Cameron Macgregor, and talk to you again.
Thank you so much.